Waitress forces black customer to pay upfront, unaware he is the owner. The Silver Spoon Cafe had stood on the corner of Willow Street for nearly 2 decades, a staple in the community that had seen families grow, friendships form, and countless stories unfold over cups of steaming coffee and plates of home-cooked meals. The cafe was known for its warm, welcoming atmosphere, the kind of place where the scent of fresh bread and sizzling bacon greeted you at the door, where the hum of friendly conversation blended with the clatter of plates and silverware. To the regulars, it was more than just a cafe. It was a second home. Each morning, retirees gathered by the large bay window, newspapers spread across the table as they debated the latest news. College students often huddled in the corner booth, laptops open as they sipped on endless refills of coffee. Families came on weekends for their favorite breakfast specials, and couples shared quiet moments over plates of pancakes and eggs. If you asked anyone who ran the cafe, they'd point to Mr. Lewis, the head manager. With his crisp apron and ever-present smile, he had become the familiar face of the Silver Spoon. He knew the regulars by name, remembered how they liked their coffee, and always made sure newcomers felt just as welcome. It was easy to assume that he was the owner. After all, he was always there, keeping things running smoothly. But the true owner of the Silver Spoon Cafe was a man named Marcus Bennett. Unlike most business owners, Marcus preferred to keep a low profile. He had built his career on passion, hard work, and a deep understanding of what made a restaurant thrive. Over the years, he had opened multiple establishments, each one designed to bring good food and comfort to the communities they served. But despite his success, he never let himself become disconnected from the heart of his businesses. He believed that the only way to truly understand how a restaurant was running was to experience it from the perspective of the people who walked through its doors every day, not as the boss, but as a customer. And so, every now and then, Marcus would visit one of his cafes unannounced. He never made a spectacle of it. He never walked in wearing a suit, never called ahead to let the staff know he was coming. Instead, he arrived as anyone else would, dressed casually, blending into the background, watching, listening, and paying attention to the little things that couldn't be captured in reports or spreadsheets. The Silver Spoon was one of his favorite places to visit. It held a special place in his heart, being one of the first restaurants he had ever opened. The moment he stepped inside, he was always reminded of why he had gotten into the business in the first place. That afternoon, Marcus found himself walking toward the familiar red brick building after a long business meeting across town. He had been meaning to check in on the Silver Spoon for a while, and now, with a few hours to spare, he decided it was the perfect time. As he approached, he took a moment to admire the cafe's storefront. The windows were decorated with handwritten signs promoting the daily specials, chicken pot pie, homemade biscuits, and their famous blueberry pancakes. The door jingled softly as he stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the cafe wrapping around him like an old friend. He glanced around, taking in the usual crowd. The retirees were in their usual spot, deep in conversation over their coffee. A young woman sat near the counter, absent-mindedly stirring her tea as she read a novel. The air smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans, and somewhere in the background, soft jazz played from the radio. Marcus smiled to himself. Everything about this place felt familiar, comforting. He made his way toward a small table by the window, the kind of seat he would have chosen even if he weren't there to observe. He settled in, stretching his legs and glancing around, his trained eye noting every detail. The servers moved with practiced ease, balancing trays and refilling drinks, exchanging friendly words with the customers. It was the kind of environment he prided himself on, one where people felt at home, where good service wasn't just a policy but a natural extension of the cafe's culture. But as Marcus sat there, something unexpected happened. He realized that, while other customers were being greeted warmly, handed menus, and engaged in friendly conversation, he had yet to receive the same treatment. He had been sitting there for several minutes now, and no one had approached his table. He watched as a server, a young woman with blonde hair tied back into a ponytail, weaved her way between tables, taking orders and chatting with the guests. She passed his table twice but didn't acknowledge him. At first, he thought it might just be an oversight. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she hadn't noticed him yet. But then he saw it. A couple walked in, not long after he had, and within moments, they were greeted with a warm smile. The same waitress handed them menus, engaged them in friendly conversation, and took their drink orders before moving along. Marcus exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the tabletop. He had seen this kind of thing before, and he knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't being ignored because the cafe was busy. He was being ignored because of an assumption. His gaze followed the waitress as she continued working, moving from table to table with ease. Finally, after what felt like far too long, she turned and made her way toward him. As she approached, she didn't offer a friendly greeting. She didn't hand him a menu. Instead, she crossed her arms, let out a small sigh, and said, "Before I take your order, I'll need you to pay in advance." Marcus blinked. The words hung between them for a moment, thick and heavy. He had been coming to places like the Silver Spoon for years, had built his businesses on the principles of good service, fairness, and hospitality. He had made it a point to ensure that every customer, regardless of who they were, felt welcome. And yet, here he was, being treated differently from every other guest in the cafe. The atmosphere around him hadn't changed. The air still smelled like fresh bread, the jazz still played softly in the background, and customers still chatted and laughed over their meals. But for Marcus, something had shifted. He met the waitress's gaze, his expression calm, unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice even. "What did you just say?" The waitress, her name tag read Lisa, gave a small shrug. "It's just our policy." Marcus glanced around, his sharp eyes taking in the other customers. Plates of food being delivered, conversations flowing effortlessly. Not a single person around him had been asked to prepay. He looked back at Lisa, his face unreadable. "I don't see anyone else paying before they eat," he said. Lisa hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Marcus had spent his career learning how to read people. And in that moment, he knew she had made an assumption about him. Instead of reacting immediately, he decided to wait, to see how far she would take it. And so, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands together, and simply said, "Tell me, Lisa, why is that?" The streets of downtown buzzed with afternoon activity as Marcus Bennett stepped out of his car and onto the sidewalk. The air was crisp, the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery mingling with the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the Silver Spoon Cafe just down the street. He adjusted the sleeves of his sweater and took in his surroundings, taking a moment to enjoy the peacefulness of the moment. Marcus had always appreciated this part of town. It had a charm that many places lacked. Small, family-owned shops lined the streets, their window displays changing with the seasons. The bookstore on the corner had been there for as long as he could remember, its wooden sign slightly worn but still inviting. Across the street, a florist was arranging a fresh bouquet in the display window, pausing every now and then to wave at passers-by. It was the kind of place that felt familiar no matter how much time passed. And the Silver Spoon Cafe was its heart. Marcus had owned the cafe for nearly a decade, yet most of the people who frequented it had no idea who he was. That was exactly how he preferred it. Unlike other restaurant owners who enjoyed making their presence known, Marcus took a different approach. He didn't need his name on the walls or his photo framed behind the register. He didn't want special treatment when he visited. He just wanted to see how things really worked when no one was watching. So, every now and then, Marcus would drop by one of his businesses unannounced. No phone calls, no messages to the manager, no heads up for the staff, just a casual visit, dressed in everyday clothes, blending in with the regulars. It was the best way to understand what was happening on the ground level, to see the service, the food quality, the atmosphere. Reports and numbers could tell him how well a place was doing financially, but they couldn't tell him how customers were actually being treated. That was something he had to see for himself. As he approached the Silver Spoon, Marcus took a moment to admire the cafe's familiar storefront. The large windows were clean, reflecting the afternoon sun. A chalkboard sign stood by the entrance, detailing the specials for the day in neat, careful handwriting. Homemade chicken pot pie, fresh biscuits, and blueberry pancakes, a classic mix of comfort food, just the way he had intended when he first opened the place. The door jingled softly as he stepped inside, and immediately, a wave of warmth wrapped around him. The smell of coffee and baked goods filled the air, and the gentle hum of conversation created an inviting atmosphere. The cafe was lively but not chaotic, filled with a mix of regulars and newcomers. At a corner table by the window, an older couple sat side by side, their hands wrapped around steaming mugs of tea as they spoke in hushed voices. Near the counter, a group of college students were laughing over a shared plate of fries, their textbooks open but clearly ignored. It was everything Marcus loved about this place. He took a slow breath, letting the familiarity of it all sink in. Despite having several restaurants under his belt, the Silver Spoon had always been special to him. It was one of the first businesses he had opened on his own, the one that had taught him the importance of building a space that felt welcoming to everyone. It wasn't just about food, it was about community. His gaze swept over the cafe, subtly taking in the details. The tables were clean, the staff moved efficiently, and the customers looked happy. So far, everything seemed in order. Still, he knew better than to make quick assumptions. The real test was in the little things. He moved toward an empty table by the window and sat down, stretching out his legs. The seat had a perfect view of the entire cafe, allowing him to watch without drawing too much attention to himself. A waitress walked by, a notepad in hand, but she didn't stop at his table. Marcus waited a few moments, expecting someone to acknowledge him, but no one did. He glanced around, watching as other customers were greeted, menus handed out, drinks served. 5 minutes passed. then 10. Still, no one approached him. His fingers tapped lightly against the wooden table. It wasn't uncommon for restaurants to get busy, for staff to be overwhelmed with orders. But Marcus had been in this business long enough to recognize the difference between an overworked team and someone intentionally being overlooked. A couple entered the cafe, chatting casually as they found a seat a few tables away from him. Almost instantly, a server approached them with a bright smile, handing them menus and offering to take their drink order. Marcus exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had walked into plenty of restaurants over the years, some his own, some belonging to others, and he had seen this kind of thing before, too many times, in fact. A server glancing over him but pretending not to notice, a hesitation, a subtle discomfort, and now, as he sat there waiting, watching as others were served before him, he felt something familiar settle in his chest. A waitress finally made her way toward him. She had a confident stride, a pen tucked behind her ear, her blonde ponytail bouncing slightly as she moved. Her name tag read Lisa. Unlike the way she had greeted the other customers, there was no warm smile this time. No friendly introduction. She stopped a few feet from his table, arms crossed, and sighed as if she had already decided he was going to be a problem. "Before I take your order," she said, her voice flat, "I'll need you to pay in advance." Marcus blinked. He had expected something like this, but hearing it out loud still sent a chill through him. His expression remained neutral as he tilted his head slightly. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Lisa shrugged. "It's just our policy." Marcus studied her carefully. Her tone was casual, as if this was a normal request, but something in her posture told him she wasn't used to saying it to every customer. His gaze flicked around the room. The couple who had just walked in had their drinks already. No one had asked them to prepay. The students at the counter had ordered without hesitation. The retirees in the corner had been served their usual without a second thought. And yet, here he was, being told he had to pay first. He turned back to Lisa, his expression unreadable. "I don't see anyone else paying before they eat," he said, his voice calm but firm. Lisa hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was long enough for Marcus to see it. She was making an assumption, and she had no idea that she had just made it in front of the person who owned the very cafe she worked in. Instead of reacting immediately, Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. He wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about how many times this had happened before, how many customers had been turned away, made to feel unwelcome, simply because someone had made a snap judgment. He took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "So, Lisa," he said, folding his hands together, "why is that?" A silence settled over the table as Marcus studied the waitress standing before him. Lisa's arms were still crossed, her posture stiff, though there was now an uneasy flicker in her expression. She had expected a simple compliance, a nod, a payment, and then she would move on, perhaps with a slight satisfaction in her step. But Marcus didn't nod. He didn't pull out his wallet. Instead, he met her gaze evenly and asked, "Why is that?" Lisa shifted uncomfortably. The confidence she had carried when she first approached him seemed to waver under the weight of his question. She glanced around quickly, as if searching for backup or an excuse, but the other waitstaff were busy attending to their tables. "Look," she said finally, her voice carrying a hint of impatience, "it's just how we do things sometimes." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Sometimes?" he echoed. "And when exactly does sometimes apply?" Lisa hesitated again, the defensive edge in her voice slipping. "It's nothing personal," she said quickly. "It's just, sometimes we have to take precautions." Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Precautions for what, exactly?" Lisa didn't answer right away. She inhaled sharply through her nose, clearly frustrated now, but still unsure how to justify her actions. "You know how it is," she muttered. Marcus exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. He had been in this exact situation before. Not here. Not in his own cafe, but in other places, other towns, other businesses. The same hesitant justifications, the same shifting body language, the same attempt to make it seem like it wasn't about him, when it very clearly was. The difference this time was that Lisa had no idea who she was speaking to. And that, Marcus decided, was exactly why he needed to push this further. He straightened up in his chair, his voice measured but firm. "No, I don't know how it is. Why don't you explain it to me?" Lisa swallowed, her confidence unraveling. She knew she had made a mistake, but she wasn't ready to admit it. Instead, she doubled down. "If you can't afford it," she said, shrugging, "there's a fast food place down the street." The words settled between them, thick with implication. A few customers nearby had stopped their conversations, sensing the tension now lingering in the air. Marcus nodded slowly, as if processing what she had just said. "I see," he said quietly. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. Lisa had made an assumption, a bold, unapologetic assumption about who he was, about what he could afford, about whether or not he belonged here. And she had done it with complete confidence that there would be no consequences. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and slid a black credit card onto the table. The kind of card that didn't have a spending limit. The kind of card that could cover the bill for every person in this cafe without making a dent in his account. Lisa eyed it, the smugness in her expression faltering. Marcus watched her reaction carefully. "Go ahead," he said. "Run it." Lisa hesitated, then quickly snatched up the card, turning on her heel and heading toward the register. As she walked away, Marcus could feel the eyes of other customers on him. A few had witnessed the interaction from the start. Some were pretending not to listen but were clearly invested now. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry, not in the way some might expect. He was disappointed. This wasn't just about him. It was about how many times this had happened before. How many customers had come into the Silver Spoon, expecting a warm meal, only to be met with the same treatment. How many had been turned away, judged before they even had a chance to sit down. Lisa returned a moment later, placing the receipt in front of him without a word. "Your card went through," she said quickly, as if eager to move past the interaction. "I'm not surprised," Marcus replied, picking it up and slipping it back into his wallet. Lisa opened her mouth as if to say something else, but before she could, a voice cut through the room. "Mr. Bennett?" Marcus turned to see Rachel, the cafe's general manager, rushing toward him, her face pale with shock. She looked panicked, her hands clasped together as she approached. "I had no idea you were stopping by today," she said, her voice slightly breathless. Lisa, who had been watching this unfold, suddenly looked confused. Marcus remained seated, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't planning on it," he said simply, "but I thought I'd drop in to see how things were going." Rachel's eyes darted between him and Lisa, and it was clear that she already knew something had gone wrong. "Is there an issue?" she asked hesitantly. Marcus gestured toward Lisa. "You should ask your employee that question." Rachel turned to Lisa, her expression expectant. Lisa's face was red now, and she shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know who he was," she said quickly, as if that somehow excused her actions. Rachel's eyes widened, then slowly closed for a moment as she took a deep breath. "Lisa," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "What did you do?" Lisa stammered, looking around as if searching for an escape. I just thought, I didn't think it was a big deal." Marcus cut in, his voice even. "She made me pay up front. No one else had to." Rachel's face drained of color. She turned back to Lisa, her voice sharp. "Please tell me you did not just do that." Lisa was now visibly flustered. I thought it was just..." Rachel turned to Marcus immediately. "I am so sorry. That is absolutely not our policy." She turned back to Lisa, her expression darkening. "I cannot believe this." Marcus took a slow sip of water before setting the glass down. "Rachel, let me ask you something." Rachel swallowed. "Yes, sir?" "If I hadn't been me today," Marcus said, tapping the table lightly, "if I had just been another customer, what do you think would have happened?" Rachel didn't answer right away. Lisa did. I didn't mean anything by it," she blurted out. Marcus shook his head. "You made a choice, and now you have to deal with the consequences." Rachel exhaled sharply, straightening her posture. "Lisa, we don't tolerate discrimination in this cafe. Ever." Lisa's eyes darted between them. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need this job." Marcus met her gaze one last time. "Then you should have thought about that before you decided to judge me." A beat of silence passed before Rachel spoke again. "Lisa, I need you to hand in your apron." Lisa hesitated, then, realizing there was no way out, slowly untied her apron and placed it on the table. Her face burned with regret as she turned and walked toward the door. Marcus watched her go, then looked back at Rachel. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly. "Make sure it doesn't happen again." Rachel nodded quickly. "I promise." Marcus exhaled, letting the tension slowly leave his shoulders. Today, the Silver Spoon had changed, and next time, he would be watching. The door swung shut behind Lisa, and with her exit, a heavy silence settled over the Silver Spoon. The cafe had never been loud to begin with, but now, even the usual clatter of plates and the soft hum of conversation seemed to have dimmed. It was as if the very air had thickened with the weight of what had just happened. Marcus took a slow breath, exhaling as he ran a hand over his chin. He had been in situations like this before, far too many times, but this time, it had been different. This time, he had been the one in control, and still, it left a bitter taste in his mouth. Rachel, the manager, was still standing by his table, looking uneasy. Her fingers twitched at her sides, as if she wanted to smooth out the tension but didn't know how. She had already apologized, but she seemed to sense that words alone weren't enough to fix what had just unfolded. "Mr. Bennett," she started hesitantly, I can't tell you how sorry I am about all of this. I swear, this is not how we run things here. Marcus nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the tabletop. I want to believe that, he said, his voice measured. But the fact that it happened at all means there's a deeper issue here. Rachel swallowed. I understand, she said quickly. I'll make sure we have a meeting with the staff. Sensitivity training, policies, whatever it takes. I don't want this to ever happen again. Marcus studied her for a moment, gauging the sincerity in her eyes. He didn't doubt that Rachel meant what she was saying. She wasn't the problem. At least, not directly. The problem was bigger than her. Bigger than just one waitress making an assumption. The problem was the mindset that had made Lisa think she could get away with it in the first place. Marcus let out a quiet sigh. Tell me something, he said. Have you ever seen Lisa treat anyone else like that before? Rachel hesitated, and in that pause, Marcus had his answer. She glanced around, as if afraid of who might be listening. She bit her lip. I don't know. Marcus arched an eyebrow. You don't know? Rachel's shoulders slumped slightly. I mean, I guess I've noticed her being a little short with some customers before, she admitted. Nothing outright like today, but maybe I should have paid closer attention. Marcus nodded slowly. There it was. Lisa's behavior hadn't come out of nowhere. This wasn't some random, isolated incident. It had been building up over time, in small moments that had gone unchecked, until finally, she had made a mistake big enough to cost her job. Rachel looked genuinely uncomfortable now. She shifted on her feet, glancing toward the counter where the other employees were sneaking glances their way. I should have caught it sooner, she said, more to herself than to Marcus. I should have stepped in before it ever got to this point. Marcus didn't say anything right away. He could see that she was grappling with it, and he let her sit with that discomfort. After a long pause, he finally spoke. It's not just about catching it, he said. It's about setting a standard, making it clear from the start that this kind of thing isn't tolerated here, not just when I happen to be the one sitting at the table, but every day. Rachel nodded quickly. You're right, she said. I'll make sure that happens. Marcus studied her for another moment, then finally leaned back in his chair. He wasn't the type to hold on to anger, but he wasn't one to let things slide either. I believe you, he said. And I'll be checking in to make sure it happens. Rachel's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded again. Of course, she said. You're always welcome here, Mr. Bennett. Marcus gave a small, knowing smile. I know. With that, Rachel excused herself, walking back toward the counter where she immediately pulled another employee aside, likely to start discussing everything that had just unfolded. Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him as he stared out the window. The city bustled beyond the glass, people moving about their day, completely unaware of the moment that had just taken place inside this cafe. And yet, moments like this shaped the world more than people realized. He thought about Lisa, about the stunned look on her face when she had been confronted with the consequences of her actions. Had she learned something today? Would she carry this lesson with her, or would she simply walk away bitter, blaming everyone but herself? Marcus had no way of knowing. What he did know was that change didn't happen in grand, sweeping gestures. It happened in moments like these. It happened in the choices people made, in the small corrections, in the refusal to stay silent. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, an email from one of his restaurant managers across town, updating him on their latest numbers. Business was good, his restaurants were thriving, and yet, none of that mattered if the people running them weren't treating every customer with dignity and respect. He tapped a quick reply, then set his phone down again, his thoughts drifting back to his childhood. He had grown up watching his parents work tirelessly to provide for their family. They had taught him the value of hard work, of treating people fairly, of never making assumptions about anyone. He had never forgotten those lessons. And now, sitting in a cafe that bore his name, he knew it was his responsibility to make sure those lessons weren't just words, but actions. The Silver Spoon wasn't just a business. It was a reflection of the values he stood for. He glanced around the cafe, his eyes settling on the customers, people of all backgrounds, all enjoying their meals, all expecting the same thing: good food and fair treatment. That was how it should be. And from this day forward, he would make sure it stayed that way. The morning after the incident at the Silver Spoon, Marcus sat in his office, staring out the window at the city skyline. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the rooftops, but his mind was already miles ahead, thinking about the changes that needed to happen. Lisa's behavior hadn't been an isolated event. He knew that. It was a symptom of a deeper issue, one that couldn't be solved by simply firing a single employee. If she had felt comfortable enough to treat him that way, how many others had suffered the same treatment? How many potential customers had walked out of his cafe without saying a word, feeling disrespected, unwelcome? Marcus had worked too hard to build his restaurants from the ground up to let something like this tarnish them. He wasn't going to let it slide. Reaching for his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Rachel's number. She had been mortified yesterday, eager to fix things, but now it was time to put that energy into action. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Hello?" Her voice sounded groggy. She probably hadn't expected a call this early. "Morning, Rachel," Marcus greeted her. "Hope I'm not waking you up." There was a brief rustling on the other end, as if she were sitting up in bed. No, it's fine. What's up?" Marcus leaned forward, his fingers tapping against his desk. "I want to meet with you and the entire staff this afternoon. We need to talk about what happened yesterday, and what's going to change moving forward." A pause. "You mean, like a staff meeting?" "More than that," he said. "This isn't just about talking. It's about setting a new standard. I need to make sure everyone in that building understands what's expected of them, and that discrimination of any kind won't be tolerated, ever." Rachel exhaled slowly. "I understand," she said. "I'll make sure everyone's there." "Good," Marcus replied. "I'll be by at 3. After hanging up, he sat back in his chair, rubbing his temple. This wasn't just about the Silver Spoon. It was about every business he owned. He opened his laptop and drafted an email to the general managers of all his restaurants. The subject line was simple: company-wide policy review, immediate action required. In the email, he outlined his expectations. Every location would implement new anti-discrimination training, customer service protocols would be revised, and managers would be required to conduct regular employee check-ins to ensure that every team member was upholding the values of the company. He didn't want this to be performative. It wasn't just about appearances. It was about making real, lasting change. Once the email was sent, Marcus allowed himself a moment to breathe. He had always believed that businesses reflected their leadership, and if he wanted his restaurants to be places of integrity, he had to lead by example. At 2:45 p.m., Marcus arrived at the Silver Spoon. As soon as he walked in, he could feel the tension in the air. The usual lively atmosphere was subdued, and employees whispered to one another as he made his way to the back office where Rachel had gathered the staff. The small meeting room was packed. Servers, cooks, cashiers, everyone who worked at the Silver Spoon was there. Some looked nervous, others simply curious. Rachel stood near the front, her arms crossed as she watched Marcus enter. He could see the way her shoulders tensed, like she was bracing herself. Marcus stepped forward and let his gaze sweep across the room. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. "I'm not here to give a lecture," he said, keeping his tone measured but firm. "I'm here because what happened yesterday was unacceptable. And if it happened once, I have no doubt it's happened before." A few employees shifted uncomfortably. "I don't care who you are, how long you've worked here, or what position you hold. Every customer who walks through that door deserves to be treated with respect. Period." Silence. "I built this business from nothing," Marcus continued. "And I built it on a foundation of fairness. No one should be made to feel like they don't belong here. No one should be judged based on their appearance. And if that's something anyone in this room has a problem with, then you're in the wrong place." A server in the back cleared his throat. "What exactly is changing?" Marcus nodded. It was a fair question. "First, we're implementing mandatory bias training for every employee. That includes recognizing prejudices, conscious or unconscious, and learning how to correct them." He glanced at Rachel, who gave him a small nod, signaling that she had already begun making arrangements for it. "Second," Marcus continued, "our hiring and training process is going to be reviewed. From now on, customer service expectations will be crystal clear. If you work here, you serve everyone equally. No assumptions, no exceptions." A few people exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Marcus clasped his hands together. "Finally, I want to make something else very clear. There will be zero tolerance for discrimination. I don't care if it's subtle. I don't care if it's unintentional. If I catch wind of it happening in any of my restaurants, you won't be getting a warning. You'll be getting your last paycheck." A murmur rippled through the room. Some employees looked relieved. Others seemed uneasy. One woman, a cook named Marisol, raised a hand. "What if a customer does it?" she asked. "What if we see a customer treating someone unfairly?" Marcus gave a small nod of approval. "Good question. If that happens, you step in. You don't turn a blind eye. If a customer is being disrespectful or discriminatory toward another guest, you have my full support to handle it. And if necessary, they can take their business elsewhere." Rachel straightened, as if emboldened by his words. "And that applies to employees too," she added, looking around the room. "If you see something, speak up. If you feel like you're being treated unfairly by a coworker, my door is open. We're not sweeping anything under the rug." Marcus could tell that some employees were still processing everything. Change wasn't easy, but it was necessary. "I know that a lot of businesses talk about diversity and inclusion," Marcus said, "but I don't want this to be a slogan. I want it to be real, and that means accountability." He let the words settle before he continued. "If anyone has questions or concerns, now's the time to speak." There was a long pause before another employee, A young server named Jordan spoke up. "I just want to say, I appreciate this," he said. "I've seen things happen before, and it didn't always feel safe to say something. So, yeah, this means a lot." Marcus nodded. That was all the confirmation he needed. "Good," he said, "because this is just the beginning." As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus knew that not everyone would change overnight, but they had been put on notice. A new standard had been set, and he would make sure it was upheld. As he left the Silver Spoon that evening, he felt something shift, not just in the restaurant, but in himself. This wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about building something better, something that would last. It had been a week since Marcus set new policies in place at the Silver Spoon, and already, he could feel the shift in the air. Employees carried themselves differently, more aware of their actions. Customers, regulars and newcomers alike, seemed more comfortable. Rachel had followed through on the bias training, and it had sparked conversations among the staff. Still, Marcus knew change wasn't something that happened overnight. It required consistency, accountability, and a willingness to stand firm, even when things got uncomfortable. That's why, despite his busy schedule, he made it a point to visit the Silver Spoon at least twice that week, always unannounced, always as a customer, just like before. He wanted to see if the staff truly absorbed the lesson or if they were simply putting on a show when they knew he was watching. This afternoon was one of those visits. Dressed in a simple gray sweater and jeans, Marcus walked through the doors and took a seat near the back, where he had a full view of the restaurant. He didn't need special treatment. He wanted to see how things ran when no one knew who he was. A few minutes later, a familiar voice greeted him. "Welcome to the Silver Spoon. Can I get you something to drink?" Marcus looked up to see Jordan, one of the younger servers who had spoken up during the meeting. The man had a bright, easygoing energy about him, and Marcus had taken note of his willingness to embrace change. "I'll have a black coffee," Marcus said, offering a nod. Jordan scribbled on his notepad. Coming right up. As he walked away, Marcus allowed himself to observe. Everything seemed to be running smoothly. Orders were coming out at a steady pace, customers were being treated with courtesy, and the air of tension from last week was all but gone. But then, the front door opened, and Marcus noticed a shift in the atmosphere. A woman in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a confident stride, stepped inside. Her long, dark coat swept against the floor as she walked in, and the moment Rachel caught sight of her, she stiffened. Marcus frowned slightly, watching as Rachel hesitated before approaching. "Mrs. Thornton," Rachel greeted, forcing a smile. "Didn't expect to see you today." Marcus recognized the name immediately. Evelyn Thornton. She was a longtime customer, one of the wealthier regulars who had been coming to the Silver Spoon for years. "Of course you didn't," Evelyn replied smoothly, removing her coat. "I've been traveling, but I always stop in when I return." Rachel hesitated, and Marcus saw something in her expression, something uncertain. "Right this way," Rachel said, leading Evelyn toward one of the nicer booths near the window. Evelyn sat down, setting her designer purse beside her. "Bring me the usual," she said dismissively, not even looking at Rachel. Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly. He had seen customers like Evelyn before, the type who believed their money granted them superiority over the staff. He had tolerated their behavior in the past, but after everything that had happened, he was no longer in the mood to ignore it. A few minutes later, Jordan returned to Marcus's table with his coffee. "Here you go," he said, placing the cup down. "Thanks," Marcus said, his focus still on the front of the restaurant. Jordan followed his gaze. "You saw her walk in, huh?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You know her well?" Jordan scoffed. "She's been coming here for years. She always makes Rachel nervous, and she's got a habit of treating some customers like they don't belong here." Marcus didn't like the sound of that. A moment later, Evelyn's voice rang out. "Excuse me, what is this?" Rachel hurried over. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Thornton?" Evelyn huffed. "This tea is cold, and it tastes off." She set the cup down with exaggerated disgust. "Honestly, Rachel, I expect better. Standards have slipped since I was last here." Rachel forced a tight smile. "I'll bring you a fresh one." As she turned, Marcus saw Evelyn roll her eyes and mutter something under her breath, something just quiet enough that Rachel wasn't supposed to hear it. Marcus had heard enough. He stood, taking his coffee with him, and walked toward Evelyn's table. She barely glanced up before saying, "If you're looking for a seat, I'm sure there's room at the counter." Marcus smirked. "Oh, I'm fine right here." That made Evelyn look up, finally registering who was standing before her. Her expression faltered for the briefest moment before she composed herself. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, sitting up straighter. "I had no idea you were in today." Marcus slid into the seat across from her, resting his cup on the table. "I like to check in from time to time." Evelyn tilted her head. "I must say, I was surprised to see the changes you're making." "Oh?" Marcus leaned back. "How so?" She took a careful sip of her tea, as if considering her words. "Well, I've been coming here for years. I've always appreciated the silver spoons. Exclusivity. Marcus's expression remained neutral. Exclusivity? Evelyn gave him a tight smile. Not everyone fits in everywhere, Mr. Carter. I'm sure you understand that. Marcus held her gaze. I do. She smiled, as if she had won something. He continued, that's exactly why I've made these changes. Because no one should walk in here and feel like they don't belong. Evelyn's expression flickered. I'm simply saying that some clientele prefer a certain environment. One that feels familiar. Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee. Let me be clear, Mrs. Thornton. This cafe is for everyone. If that's a problem for you, then perhaps the silver spoon isn't the place for you anymore. Her lips pressed together. Are you suggesting I take my business elsewhere? Marcus didn't blink. I'm saying that respect isn't optional. If you can't treat the staff and other customers with decency, then yes, I'd prefer you take your business elsewhere. Silence stretched between them. Rachel stood nearby, her hands clenched into fists. Jordan had paused behind the counter, watching. Even a few customers had turned their heads. Evelyn's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a sigh, she reached for her purse. Very well, she said, standing. Perhaps I'll return when things have settled. Marcus simply watched as she walked toward the door, pausing only to glance at Rachel. You used to run a much better establishment, she said coldly before pushing open the door and stepping out. The cafe remained silent for a beat. Then Jordan let out a low whistle. Damn, he muttered. Rachel let out a shaky breath and turned to Marcus. Thank you, she said softly. Marcus shook his head. You don't have to thank me. This is how it should have been from the start. She nodded, looking down. I never felt like I could stand up to her before. Well, you don't have to do it alone anymore, Marcus said firmly. Rachel straightened, her shoulders lighter than before. For the first time in a long time, the Silver Spoon truly felt like a place where everyone belonged. And that was exactly how Marcus intended to keep it. It had been 2 weeks since Evelyn Thornton stormed out of the Silver Spoon, and while the cafe had adjusted well to its new policies, Marcus knew the real test of change came not from the easy days, but the difficult ones. So far, the atmosphere had improved significantly. The employees were more mindful of how they treated customers, and regulars noticed the shift. A more diverse crowd had started frequenting the cafe, and word was spreading about the positive changes Marcus had implemented. But not everyone was happy. It started subtly. Some of the old regulars, the ones who had been used to the Silver Spoon feeling like a private club rather than a public cafe, began making complaints. Some claimed the quality of service had declined. Others suggested that the cafe had become too crowded. Rachel mentioned that a few customers even made snide remarks about how the place had changed too much. Marcus knew exactly what they meant. They weren't upset about the quality of the cafe. They were upset that it was no longer catering to their exclusivity. And then, late one afternoon, the breaking point arrived. It was an unusually busy day. The cafe was packed with customers, students working on laptops, families sharing pastries, and elderly couples chatting over cups of tea. The energy was warm, welcoming. Marcus was seated in the corner, taking notes on his tablet, when the front door swung open with a sharp jingle. Evelyn Thornton was back. This time, she didn't come alone. 2 other women, both dressed in elegant coats and carrying expensive handbags, followed her inside. Their sharp eyes scanned the cafe, their lips tightening as they took in the bustling crowd. Rachel, who had been helping a customer at the counter, spotted them and visibly tensed. Jordan, standing beside her, muttered under his breath, "Oh boy, here we go." Marcus closed his tablet and leaned back in his seat. He had been expecting this. Evelyn strode forward as if she owned the place, heading straight for the counter. When Rachel greeted her, Evelyn ignored the usual pleasantries. "I'd like a booth," she said curtly. Rachel glanced around. Every booth was occupied. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornton," she said, keeping her voice polite but firm. "All of our booths are currently taken. You're welcome to wait or take a table instead." Evelyn's expression turned icy. "You expect me to sit at one of those small tables? I always sit at a booth." Rachel nodded. "I understand, but we're first come, first served." Evelyn's eyes flicked to a booth near the back, where a young black couple was seated, chatting over coffee. "That table has been here long enough," she said with a dismissive wave. "You can ask them to move." The cafe grew noticeably quieter. Marcus saw Rachel's hands clench at her sides. "I'm sorry, but we don't ask customers to move for others," Rachel said evenly. Evelyn let out a sharp laugh, turning to the women beside her. "Do you hear this? First, this place gets overrun, and now we can't even get decent service." Marcus had heard enough. He stood and walked toward the counter. "Is there a problem?" he asked casually. Evelyn turned to him, her expression flickering with something unreadable. "Mr. Carter, how nice of you to make an appearance." Marcus folded his arms. "I like to keep an eye on things." She gave him a tight smile. "Good. Then you'll want to know that your employee here is refusing to accommodate longtime customers. He arched an eyebrow. You mean Rachel? Yes, she said sharply. She's denying us a booth while letting. She gestured vaguely toward the back, careful not to say the words outright. Others linger without ordering anything substantial. Marcus's gaze hardened. He turned to Rachel. Did you explain that all the booths are occupied? Rachel nodded. Yes, sir. Did you offer them a table instead? Yes. Marcus turned back to Evelyn. Then I don't see the problem. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. You used to run a better establishment, Mr. Carter. One that understood the importance of catering to loyal customers. Marcus didn't flinch. I still run a great establishment. One that treats every customer with the same respect. Evelyn scoffed. Don't be naive. Places like this thrive because of people like me. I've been bringing my friends here for years. Do you think these new customers will show the same loyalty? Marcus met her gaze evenly. Loyalty means nothing if it's based on exclusion. Evelyn's lips pursed. She turned to Rachel. Get me a table. I suppose I have no choice. Rachel started to grab menus, but Marcus held up a hand. Actually, Mrs. Thornton, he said, I think it's time we part ways. Evelyn frowned. Excuse me. Marcus gestured toward the door. If you can't respect my staff or my customers, I don't think the Silver Spoon is the right place for you anymore. The silence in the cafe was absolute. Rachel's eyes widened. Jordan nearly dropped the coffee he was pouring. Evelyn let out a sharp laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. You're joking. Marcus didn't blink. I'm not. Her face darkened. You'd really throw away years of my business? Marcus tilted his head. I'd rather have a cafe that welcomes everyone than one that only caters to a select few. Evelyn stared at him, her jaw tightening. Then, with a sharp huff, she grabbed her purse. Unbelievable, she muttered. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the door, her two friends trailing behind her. As she reached for the handle, she paused and glanced over her shoulder. You'll regret this, she said. Mark my words, Carter. Marcus remained unmoved. I think I'll be just fine. And with that, Evelyn Thornton walked out of the Silver Spoon for good. For a long moment, the cafe was still. Then, slowly, a round of quiet applause started. First from the young couple at the booth Evelyn had tried to claim, then from a few other customers, until the entire cafe was buzzing with murmurs of approval. Rachel exhaled, looking at Marcus with a mix of shock and gratitude. Jordan grinned. Man, I wish I had recorded that. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. That's not why I did it. Rachel nodded. I know. And she did. This wasn't about theatrics. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about setting a standard, one that the Silver Spoon would stand by from now on. No more catering to privilege. No more bending the rules for the sake of longtime customers who thought they were above others. From now on, the Silver Spoon would be a place where respect wasn't optional. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The cafe had just reached its breaking point. And in doing so, it had finally become the place he had always envisioned. The day Evelyn Thornton was shown the door at the Silver Spoon became an unspoken milestone for the cafe. For some, it was a moment of reckoning. For others, it was a moment of relief. But for Marcus Carter, it was the beginning of a new challenge. The tension that had crackled in the cafe after Evelyn's dramatic exit dissipated quickly, replaced by an energy of quiet admiration. Many customers who had been watching the confrontation unfold had nodded approvingly or offered small words of encouragement as they left that day. Still, Marcus knew that not everyone felt the same way. The next morning, he arrived early, as usual, taking a deep breath before unlocking the doors. The cafe had always been a labor of love, and he wasn't about to let one conflict shake what he had built. Rachel and Jordan arrived shortly after him, both of them looking expectant. So, Rachel said, leaning against the counter. Think she's coming back? Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. If she does, she won't get past the door. Jordan grinned. Man, that was legendary. I mean, I know it was serious, but watching her storm out like that was satisfying. Marcus shot him a knowing look. Yeah, well, let's hope the fallout isn't too bad. Jordan's grin faded slightly. You think there will be fallout? Rachel folded her arms. Oh, there will be. Evelyn Thornton has connections. She's not going to take this quietly. And she was right. By noon, the phone had rung at least a dozen times with complaints, some from anonymous voices accusing the Silver Spoon of being ungrateful to its longtime customers, others outright calling for a boycott. The cafe's social media pages were buzzing too. Some comments praised Marcus's stance, calling it a win for inclusivity and fairness. Others, however, weren't so supportive, disrespecting a loyal customer over a simple request? Terrible business sense. Guess I won't be bringing my book club here anymore. This place used to have standards. This is what happens when you cater to the wrong crowd. Pathetic. Marcus had expected some backlash, but seeing it in real time was still frustrating. He knew that for every disgruntled regular who vowed never to return, There were 2 new customers who felt safer and more welcomed. And that was what mattered. The turning point. Around 2 p.m., as the lunch rush slowed, Marcus was pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee when Rachel walked up with her phone in hand. "You're gonna want to see this," she said, turning the screen toward him. Marcus frowned as he read. It was a post from a local online forum, and at the top of it was a dramatic headline. "Local cafe disrespects prominent resident. Is this the end of the Silver Spoon?" Beneath it was a detailed, highly biased retelling of the incident with Evelyn Thornton. The post painted her as a beloved patron who had always supported small businesses and Marcus as a hot-headed owner who humiliated her over a simple seating request. Rachel scoffed. "She really went and played the victim." Jordan leaned over to read. "Man, they make it sound like you personally threw her into the street." Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temple. "She's trying to turn the town against us." Rachel hesitated. "Do you think it'll work?" Marcus thought about it. There was no denying that Evelyn had influence. She moved in circles that had power: business owners, local officials, socialites. If she wanted to make life difficult for the Silver Spoon, she had the means to do it. But Marcus had something she didn't: a community that believed in what he was building. And that community was already stepping up. He scrolled down to the comments on the post, expecting to see more anger and calls for a boycott. Instead, he saw something else. "I was there that day, and that's not what happened." Mrs. Thornton demanded a table that was already taken and tried to get people kicked out. The owner did the right thing. "So let me get this straight. A cafe refuses to give special treatment to a wealthy customer, and suddenly they're the bad guys? Give me a break. The Silver Spoon is one of the few places in town where everyone actually feels welcome. I'll be supporting them more after this, not less." Marcus smiled to himself. The truth had a way of rising to the surface. The unexpected visitor. Later that afternoon, just as the cafe had settled into a quiet lull, the front door swung open, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her early 50s, wearing a stylish navy blue blazer and carrying a leather-bound notebook. Her sharp eyes scanned the cafe before they landed on Marcus. He recognized her immediately. Vivian Aldridge. A well-known food critic and columnist, Vivian had been covering local businesses for years. She had the power to make or break a restaurant's reputation with just a few words in print. Marcus wiped his hands on a towel and stepped forward. "Ms. Aldridge, welcome to the Silver Spoon." She nodded, offering a polite but unreadable smile. "Mr. Carter, may I have a moment of your time?" "Of course." He led her to a quiet corner of the cafe, where she flipped open her notebook. "I assume you're aware of the, controversy surrounding your cafe at the moment?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Hard to miss." She studied him for a moment. "And you stand by your decision?" "Absolutely," Marcus said without hesitation. "I built this cafe on the idea that everyone should feel welcome. If that means losing a few customers who don't believe in that, so be it." Vivian tapped her pen against the notebook thoughtfully. "It's a bold stance. Not every business owner would be willing to take that risk." Marcus met her gaze. "Then maybe more of them should." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "I like that answer." She closed her notebook and stood. "You'll be seeing my article in next week's column. I think you'll find it fair." And with that, she left. A shift in the tide. A week later, the article was published. To Marcus's surprise, it wasn't just fair, it was glowing. Vivian had detailed the incident with Evelyn Thornton in a way that presented the truth, highlighting Marcus's stance against discrimination and his commitment to making the Silver Spoon a truly welcoming space. And the response was overwhelming. New customers flooded in, eager to support a business that stood for something. Social media lit up with praise. Even some of the former regulars, those who had initially been wary, began to trickle back in, realizing that the Silver Spoon was still the same cozy cafe they had always loved. Just better. Marcus watched it all unfold with a deep sense of pride. The storm had come. The backlash had happened. But in the end, the Silver Spoon had not only survived, it had thrived. And he knew that as long as he stayed true to his values, it always would. The morning after Vivian Aldridge's article was published, the Silver Spoon felt different. The air carried a buzz of excitement, as if something had shifted in the very foundation of the cafe. Marcus arrived early, as always, unlocking the doors and stepping inside just as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows. The scent of freshly ground coffee beans filled the air, mingling with the warm aroma of cinnamon and butter from the pastries that Rachel had already begun preparing. He took a deep breath, savoring the moment. This cafe had always been his dream, a space where people from all walks of life could gather, laugh, and share stories over a good meal. And now, despite the challenges, that vision was stronger than ever. Rachel poked her head out from the kitchen, her apron already dusted with flour. "So, boss, how does it feel to be the talk of the town?" Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "You mean the most controversial cafe owner in the city?" Jordan, who was setting up tables, smirked. "Nah, man, More like a local legend. Marcus didn't consider himself a legend. He had simply done what was right, but as he glanced around, he could see the ripple effects of that choice. Over the past few days, something remarkable had happened. New customers were pouring in, not just the usual faces, but people who had never set foot in the Silver Spoon before. Some came because they had read the article and wanted to support a business that stood for inclusivity. Others arrived simply because they had heard the cafe was great and wanted to see for themselves. And then there were those who returned. The regulars who had initially wavered, unsure about the controversy, had begun to trickle back. They came in hesitantly at first, as if testing the waters, but once they saw that nothing had changed, except for the absence of a certain demanding customer, they settled back into their routines. One of them was Mr. Langley, an elderly man who had been coming to the Silver Spoon for years. As he stepped through the door that morning, Marcus smiled. "Good to see you, Mr. Langley." "The usual?" The old man adjusted his cap and nodded. "You know, Marcus, I wasn't sure if I'd come back after all that nonsense, but I read that article, and I realized something. This place has always been about community, and that's why I came here in the first place." Marcus felt a swell of gratitude. "Well, I'm glad you're here," Mr. Langley chuckled. "Besides, where else am I going to get a cup of coffee that doesn't taste like burnt regret?" Marcus laughed, clapping him on the shoulder before heading back behind the counter. The growth of a movement. As the day went on, it became clear that the Silver Spoon had not just survived the controversy, it had thrived because of it. A local activist group reached out, wanting to collaborate on a community event celebrating diversity in small businesses. A journalist from a bigger publication contacted Marcus, asking if he'd be open to an interview about his experience. And then, something truly unexpected happened. Around lunchtime, the door swung open, and a familiar figure walked in. Daniel Carter, Marcus's older brother. Daniel had always been the more corporate-minded of the two. He owned several restaurants in the city, but unlike Marcus, he preferred a more detached approach to management, one built on efficiency and profits rather than community engagement. Marcus hadn't seen him in months, and the sudden visit caught him off guard. Daniel scanned the cafe, taking in the bustling atmosphere, before walking up to the counter. "You've been making waves, little brother." Marcus wiped his hands on a towel. "You here to congratulate me or give me a lecture?" Daniel smirked. "A little of both." Marcus crossed his arms. "All right, let's hear it." Daniel sighed. "I won't lie. I thought you were making a mistake when I first heard about what happened. Kicking out a longtime customer? Not exactly a safe business move." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "But," Daniel leaned against the counter, "but, I underestimated you." Marcus blinked in surprise. He wasn't sure he had ever heard his brother say that before. "I read the article," Daniel continued. "I saw the way people responded. You didn't just stand your ground. You turned this place into something bigger than a cafe. You turned it into a statement." Marcus exhaled. "I didn't do it to make a statement. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Daniel nodded. "And that's why it worked." For a moment there was silence between them, a rare but meaningful understanding passing between brothers. Then Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the counter. "What's this?" Marcus asked, picking it up. "A business proposition," Daniel said. "No strings attached, just something to think about." Marcus hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a check, a significant one. His eyes widened. "Daniel, this is..." "A show of faith," Daniel interrupted. "I don't do what you do, Marcus. I run restaurants, not community hubs. But I can see now that there's something to this. Something worth investing in." Marcus stared at the check, conflicted. He and Daniel had always had different approaches to business. He had never wanted to be reliant on his brother's resources. But this wasn't charity. It was an investment in something he had built with his own hands. He met Daniel's gaze. "I'll think about it." Daniel smirked. "That's all I ask." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Marcus standing there, check in hand, heart pounding with the possibilities of what lay ahead, looking toward the future. That evening, as the cafe closed up, Marcus sat alone at a corner table, staring at the check. Rachel sat across from him, arms folded. "Are you gonna take it?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know." Jordan leaned against a chair. "Dude, you could do so much with that money. Expand the cafe, improve the kitchen, maybe even open a second location." Marcus nodded. He had thought of all those things, but he had also thought about what it would mean to accept it. Finally, he sighed. I think I want to use it for something bigger than just the cafe." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Marcus looked around, taking in the warmth of the space, the memories that filled every corner. Then, an idea began to take shape. "What if we used it to create something new?" he said slowly. "A program, maybe. Something that helps small businesses like ours. A way to support minority-owned cafes and restaurants, to make sure no one has to deal with what we just went through." Rachel's eyes widened. "You want to start a whole movement?" Marcus chuckled. Maybe not a movement, but something real, something that lasts. Jordan grinned. Damn, man, you don't just play the game, you change the whole field. Marcus leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just thinking about survival. He was thinking about the future. And it was bright. The first anniversary of the Silver Spoon's transformation arrived with little fanfare but immense significance. A year had passed since Marcus stood his ground. Since the cafe had become more than just a place to grab a coffee, it had become a symbol. As Marcus unlocked the front door that morning, he took a deep breath, feeling the crisp autumn air against his skin. The city outside bustled as always, but inside the Silver Spoon, there was a quiet moment of reflection. He had come so far. A year ago, he had been unsure if his cafe would survive after the controversy. Now, he wasn't just running a thriving business, he was part of something bigger, building something bigger. Over the past year, Marcus had put Daniel's investment to good use, but not in the way people expected. Instead of expanding the Silver Spoon into a second location, he had launched the Community Table Initiative. The program was designed to help small, independent cafes and restaurants, especially those owned by people of color, navigate the challenges of the industry. They provided financial mentorship, marketing guidance, and even emergency grants for businesses facing discrimination or hardship. At first, it had been just an idea, a way to ensure that what happened to him didn't happen to others. But it had grown. With Daniel's backing, and later the support of other investors who saw the impact it was making, the Community Table Initiative had helped over a dozen small businesses in the city find their footing. And today, on the cafe's anniversary, Marcus had something even bigger planned, a morning full of surprises. As the morning rush settled, Rachel handed Marcus a cup of coffee and raised an eyebrow. So, any clue why Daniel said he'd be stopping by today? Marcus smirked. He just said it was important. Jordan, who had been working the espresso machine, leaned over the counter. Man, if your brother shows up with another giant check, you better ask for a giant cake to go with it. Marcus chuckled. We'll see. Right on cue. The front door swung open, and Daniel walked in, dressed in his usual sharp suit, but today with an unusual grin on his face. Morning, little brother, he said, sliding into a seat at the counter. Morning, Marcus replied, setting a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. So, what's the big news? Daniel took a sip before reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out an envelope, much like he had done a year ago. Marcus stared at it. Not another investment check, is it? Daniel smirked. Not quite. Curious, Marcus took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a legal document. His eyes skimmed over the words, the Community Table Initiative, before landing on something that made him freeze. Ownership transfer. Marcus looked up, his heart pounding. Daniel, this is... Daniel nodded. It's yours now. For a moment, Marcus couldn't find the words. You built this, Marcus, Daniel continued. Sure, I helped fund it, but you were the one who made it real. And after watching you grow it over the past year, I realized something. You don't need my investment anymore. You need ownership. Full ownership. Marcus exhaled, feeling the weight of what this meant. The initiative wasn't just a side project anymore. It was his. Rachel, who had been listening in, grinned. Damn, you just became the official boss of a whole movement. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. I don't know about a movement. Daniel smirked. Call it what you want, but you've changed the way people think about small businesses. And that's worth more than any check I could write. A celebration of change. As the day went on, the cafe was busier than ever. Customers who had stood by the Silver Spoon through its toughest times came by to congratulate Marcus. People who had been helped by the Community Table Initiative stopped in to share how their businesses had flourished. One of them was Sofia Morales, a baker who had nearly lost her shop after facing unfair rent hikes. Thanks to the initiative, she had been able to relocate to a better space without losing her loyal customers. She hugged Marcus as she handed him a small box of pastries. You don't know how much you helped me, she said. I don't know if my bakery would still be here without your program. Marcus smiled, feeling a swell of pride. You did the hard work, Sophia. I just made sure you had the chance. A final lesson. As the evening approached, Marcus finally found a quiet moment to sit at his favorite booth by the window. The cafe had wound down, and Rachel and Jordan were finishing up for the night. Daniel sat across from him, watching him carefully. You know, he said, I always thought I had this business thing all figured out. That it was just about numbers, efficiency, and profit margins. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And? Daniel smirked. And I was wrong. He leaned forward. You've built something I never could, Marcus. Something that's not just profitable but meaningful. That's rare. And it's why I know you'll keep this going long after today. Marcus nodded, taking in his brother's words. For years, he had looked up to Daniel as the business-savvy one. The one who knew how to make things happen. But now, sitting here, he realized something. He wasn't following in Daniel's footsteps anymore. He was making his own. A legacy begins. As Marcus locked up the cafe that night, he stood outside for a moment, looking at the sign above the door, the silver spoon. It had been through so much, had evolved into something he never expected, but it was still home. And now, with the community table initiative fully in his hands, he knew his work wasn't done. This was just the beginning. He glanced up at the night sky, taking a deep breath before heading down the street toward his apartment. Tomorrow, there would be more challenges, more stories to tell, more people to help, and Marcus Carter was ready for all of it. Because this wasn't just about a cafe anymore. It was about a legacy, and it had only just begun.